All right, in our last segment, we finished qualitative research, and now we are picking up with quantitative research. The first type is called descriptive research. Descriptive research is used to describe something such as a group in terms of demographics, preferences, buying patterns, usage of a product, etc. So to describe something such as a group. Now, two different kinds most often used in consumer issues. Panels compose of a sample of consumers or potential consumers who provide quantitative information over time. Over time. So this is a form of longitudinal research. As an example, Nielsen tracks members' weekly grocery purchases by having them record and purchase them with cell phone scans. Surveys are filled out one at a time, so they provide information that can be quantified at one point in time. So this is called cross-sectional research. The most popular form of survey research today, for consumer issues, that is called the mall intercept. This is where consumers are stopped and questioned in a mall. You've probably had this happen to you. There are also what is called distance surveys, which are surveys that are given over the internet or the phone. When doing survey research, you really need to worry about two things: response rates and question wording in particular. So phone surveys, for instance, get the lowest response rates. And here is a poorly worded survey question, very poorly worded. In order to prevent terrorism, should airports be able to conduct passenger searches based on racial profiling or suspicious behavior? Now, there are a number of things wrong with this question, right? It is something that is called double-barreled. So you might have noticed it actually includes two questions. A problem there if you would answer those two differently. Also, it's a leading question, right? In order to prevent terrorism. What's that doing there? It's leading people towards one answer. And then there's a social desirability concern here, because racial matters can be sensitive. People may not be honest in their responses. Our second type of quantitative research, actually our second and third types, should be reviewed for you from introductory psych, but we'll still do a really quick brief review of these. So we use the second type, correlational research, when we are looking for relationships, right? Remember that? Remember that there are positive and negative relationships. If two factors are positively related, if one's up, the other tends to be up. An example that would be grades in studying, right? If studying is up, grades tend to be up. If two factors are negatively related, that is also called an inverse relationship. If one is down, the other tends to be up. So if one's down, the other tends to be up, or vice versa, right? So an example of this would be grades in partying. So if partying's up, it tends to be up, grades tend to be down for that person. How do we do correlational research? Super easy. We just measure both variables. For example, is there a relationship between color saturation in ads and sales? You can measure color saturation in a large number of ads and measure the sales produced by each ad. So you're just measuring both. Then you conduct a correlational analysis, and you hopefully remember that this produces a correlation coefficient, which is between what number and what number. And hopefully you remember that is a positive one and a negative one. So the closer to either end of that positive one or negative one ends of the scale, the stronger the relationship, right? So how would no relationship be indicated in your correlation coefficient? Remember, that's around 0. So usually it's around maybe a negative 0.2 to a positive 0.2. Okay. But remember that correlational research is limited. It doesn't tell us about causation. Color saturation may seem to increase sales, but the variables don't exist in isolation, and we are doing simply correlational research at this point. This means other confounding variables exist. For instance, prices may have been lower when lower saturations were used, because prices tend to increase over time. So if we get a significant correlation coefficient, we can say the two are related, but the only way we can explore if saturation increases, in other words, causes sales, is to do experimental research. So our third form of quantitative research and most advanced form of research is the experiment. The experiment is the Cadillac of research because it is the only way to determine cause. To do this, we must ourselves vary the IV. Remember that? The IV being what? Hopefully you remember that's the independent variable. We must vary it. We can't just measure it. Then we simply measure the DV, but here's the tricky part, while controlling for everything else. So remember, the IV, the independent variable, is the one we vary. The DV, the dependent variable, is the one we measure at the end to see if there was an effect on it. Again, this should be review for you. Also, experimental groups and control groups, right? The experimental group gets the IV. In other words, high saturation here. The control group does not. That would be low saturation. In order to control for everything else, remember that you also must use random assignment and random selection. Random selection is necessary. The sample must be randomly selected from the population to be studied. So when we pull a sample randomly from the population, do you remember the letter and the type of letter that is used to designate that in research methods? Hopefully you remember that is a uppercase N. Now, say you want to study members of a very popular senior organization, very popular, with, say, 1,000 members. You would need to randomly select your sample of, say, 200 randomly, meaning that each member has an equal chance of being selected. Random assignment is different, and it is also necessary to control for everything else. You must randomly assign your participants then, your 200 participants, to the experimental and control groups. Now, do you remember what letter and type of letter is designated to represent the number of participants in each group, the experimental group and the control group? Hopefully you remembered lowercase n's. So, for example, in this case, you might flip a coin for each participant. Heads into the experimental group, tails into the control group. Think about this question. Does color saturation increase sales? Does it increase sales? So now we're not saying, is it related to sales? It's easy to see if they're related and do a correlational study. You just measure both things, right? But to study cause, does it increase sales? This is cause. You would have to do something like this. First, you would have to vary the IV, right? The independent variable. So you would have to make 2 identical ads for the same product. Identical except what? Remember your treatment of the IV, the independent variable, right? So everything will be identical in these ads, except one will be high in saturation and one will be low. The sales of what population? So let's say that you want to study ASU college freshmen. So a randomly drawn sample of college freshmen would perhaps be offered enough money that most of them would participate. Next, we'd have to randomly assign them into the experimental or control group. high saturation or low saturation, respectively. Finally then, we would have them review the ad for their group and rate how likely they would be to buy the product. This is a lot more complicated and expensive and time-consuming than correlational research, right? But if the experimental group is significantly more likely to buy, this has to be because of the saturation. Saturation has to be the cause because everything else was controlled for. Now, the forms of research most often used in marketing to explore consumer issues are exploratory focus groups, descriptive panels, and descriptive surveys. The forms of research most often used in psychology to explore consumer issues are correlational studies and experiments. Neuroimaging is one of the newest, most fascinating, but also most controversial types of consumer research being done today. This involves imaging of the brain. In other words, for example, PET scans, MRIs, etc. Brain imaging can be used, for example, to look for positive and negative reactions to certain logos or images or products. Clearly, this is a fascinating idea because, in theory, it could capture conscious and unconscious associations. But the controversy lies in the validity of these methods, which to date are still questionable when used for this purpose. But as they gain in popularity and the technology improves, it is possible that they will gain in strength. However, there is more than one barrier here. The use of neuroimaging is limited because of the expense. It may never be financially feasible to study mass responses. In our next and final lecture segment, we will take a peek at some coming attractions, what we will be covering later on in this class.